Success Insight shares the stories of the people with passion and drive who make things happen in the world. Here's your host, Howard Fox.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Success Insight podcast. Our guest today is Kyle Hegarty. Kyle is the author of The Accidental Business Nomad, a survival guide for working across a shrinking planet. Just to give you a little bit of information about Kyle, he's the managing director of Leadership Nomad, part of the TSL Marketing group, where he focuses on helping world-class companies expand across the globe. The Accidental Business Nomad was published by Nicholas Brealey, and it is being launched this month. So, Kyle, welcome to the Success Insight podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Howard.
And really, congratulations on this wonderful book, The Accidental Business Nomad. As I was reading it, I was literally shaking my head and smiling, a little bit of laughing, because it brought back some stories. So, Kyle, before we kind of dive into the book, if you would, could you give our listeners a little bit of overview of your background and how you got to where you are?
Yeah, so I'm a sales and marketing guy. I've been doing this really for almost 20 years, helping companies build pipeline, really. Just how do you grow, whether it's domestically or internationally? And in about 2005 it started, 2006 I moved. I essentially just started saying to my clients out of the US, hey, we can do this in Asia. Or I might have even phrased it slightly differently. I might have said, hey, we're doing this in Asia. Probably got ahead of myself. So many companies just jumped on board. They said, if you can help me with pipeline and help us expand into Asia, we'll sign on the dotted line today. And I ended up zipping back and forth with these contracts, trying to figure out what the heck to do with them. And very quickly, it became clear that the business opportunity was more in that growth region than anywhere else. So I stayed in Asia, been here ever since.
How did you come to make this jump? Was it to Asia? Now you are in Singapore right now. Have you always been in Singapore?
I've always lived in Singapore. Singapore is very much of a transit point. I mean, it's a nice little city. I think we've got about 5.5 million people population. So from a sizing standpoint, it really is just one city's worth of business. So it's kind of a launching point off for the rest of the region. So I've been here the whole time, but the focus has been region-wide. I guess your question is, how did I choose here? Or
I mean, did somebody kind of knock on your door at work and say, Kyle, I've got an opportunity for you? Or did you say, there's opportunity here, you recognize it, and you got on a plane? I mean, how did that happen?
There was a combination of things. There's always a girl involved in these stories, Howard. So you gotta always have.
Yeah.
I was dating this woman out of Boston, and she still is a scientist, and she was collaborating with these groups here in Singapore. So she is responsible for starting this. She planted all the seeds. I then said, okay, Singapore. I don't know anything about Singapore, and as I was, we were basically just kind of throwing these ideas out there. Hey, what if we did this? We don't have kids. We don't have a mortgage. This was 2006. This was, so the timing was actually very good. It's like, maybe I'll buy a house in 2006 or go to Asia. And I think my Asia choice, I got lucky on that one because the financial crisis hit everybody pretty soon after. But that was why Singapore, and Singapore is quite an easy place to get established from an infrastructure standpoint. And just again, it's kind of like the gateway to the rest of Asia. And so one of the reasons I wrote the book was because so many other people and companies they still choose Singapore as a launch point for the region because of its ease of use. It's often called Asia Light, and there's good reason for that.
Oh, that's great. And really, I'm amazed at just the way sometimes opportunities come about. And, like you said, it was about a woman, like, okay, that's a good problem to have. I'm curious about something. And years ago, this would probably be mid-90s, I was asked to go to the UK. And needless to say, it was an English-speaking country. We're fairly close culturally, for the most part. We don't get each other's jokes. But while it was a good project, a good time, I also crashed and burned. So I can only imagine someone going from a Western culture into an Asian culture, or even South American, African. How do you prepare for a jump like that? Because culturally, there's a lot of differences.
There are. And here's a counterintuitive data point for you. The biggest failure rate between expat assignments happens between the United States and the United Kingdom. So your experience was not unique. And I think that that's counterintuitive because your point earlier, which is, hey, we share this common background. We've got this same language. There's a lot of similarities here. And the research suggests that the reason for this is because we tend to ignore the underlying cultural components, the invisible stuff. The phrasing is one part, how work gets done, how humor is delivered, how we make, business choices and that work-life balance. All of these types of things we tend to ignore if we hear somebody speaking the same language. We almost automatically assume that everything else is the same. And that, I think, is the reason why there's such a challenge between the US and UK. And I should probably say that girlfriend who I followed to Asia is now my wife, and she's in the other room, and she's British as well. So I've got a couple of decades of British UK communication challenge stories. If that's another book, probably.
I imagine it is, and please don't tell your wife. You're not going to believe what this guy just asked me on the podcast.
No, not at all. It's a common challenge, and I guess your question was, well, wait a minute. If the US and UK is so similar, what's it like going to the other side of the world where it's quite different? And in some ways, it's easier because there's so much more variation and diversity going on. Your guard is up. You kind of know, like, wait a minute, there's something different going on here. Japan is probably an extreme example where you get such a rich and different cultural experience. There's language barriers. There's everything is different. So you're kind of constantly tiptoeing through the cultural landmines. What tends to happen is when you end up with somebody who speaks the same language at that surface level, people tend to let their guard down and make assumptions that everything else is even. And probably the best example of that in Asia would be the Philippines. You and I come from some similar backgrounds. I'm really, when I say building sales pipeline for businesses, a big chunk of that comes from call center work. And so I ended up spending a ton of time across the Philippines trying to get Filipino call centers handling U.S. business opportunities and business contracts. And the language in the Philippines is excellent English. And there's a number of reasons for that. But what companies continue to ignore is the invisible stuff. And that's what this book is about. It's to say, look, there are a lot of other invisible things going on underneath the surface from a working style standpoint. And if you can decode that, you can fast track yourself to hopefully not make all of the stupid mistakes that I've made and so many of the rest of us have been making for the last few decades or arguably centuries.
It's a great segue because, and I'll also add, a few minutes ago, you used the word research. And I come from what I would call a scholar practitioner background as far as my leadership development coaching practice. And one of the aspects of the coaching that I really, really got into, and it's probably why your book resonated so much, was this topic of cultural intelligence and those data points that you just described, phraseology, work style, how we interact, our focus on time, in the language. And can you kind of describe how you went about learning about these data points and something, it's not just about coming here and expecting the work's going to get done because I said so, but there's other things I need to learn and I need to communicate differently. So what are some of those data points?
So, and I'll answer that here in a roundabout way to a degree. I got here, and like so many others, what happens is you go through a bit of a honeymoon, everything is working great, and then everything just stops working. Everybody who's kind of nodding and smiling and saying yes, you feel like, okay, this is easy. I don't know what the big deal is. And by the way, this exactly happens with remote teams, which we'll get into as well. But after a couple of weeks, those smiles, those yeses, those agreements that you think you have don't follow through the way you expect them to, and things start falling apart. And so what does any self-respecting expat do at the end of the week? You go to an expat bar and you drown your sorrows and you chat with whoever else is sitting there and you start trading stories and you start actually picking up insights. Now, that is a okay thing to do, but as I was here longer and longer, it's like, you got to be a little bit careful with these bar stories, because while they actually can be helpful and you can pick up a lot of good info, I wanted more data. I wanted more science and research behind this. I didn't want a bunch of expats with 20 years experience kind of telling me their war stories and hoping that those anecdotes somehow weave together to form a plan. That wasn't good enough. So I started going back and finding out that, I'm not the only one going through these challenges, that of not being able to get stuff done. There are decades of research that's been done looking at this invisible stuff. So what I'm talking about is, how do people communicate? There are direct communicators, there's indirect communicators. What does that mean? And what you'll get is researchers really since the end of World War II who have looked at these differences and started to put definition to them and actually map them across the planet. How do people deal with confrontation? Are you someone who just jumps into a conversation, says it like it is, and start almost, do you solve problems through constructive arguments or sometimes not constructive argument? Or do you avoid argument at all costs and find other indirect ways to do it, to save face, to avoid conflict? How do you build relationships? Are you somebody from a working standpoint who I could just, maybe you and I just can talk for 5 minutes and you know what, let's try a business deal. Let's do something together. Or is it the other way where you and I would need to spend a lot more time together before we start doing any business activities at all? So all of these are examples of these working styles that have this considerable variation. You mentioned time. That's another one. I do a lot of work in Switzerland and Germany. And, if I'm showing up on time, I'm sending a text message apologizing because I'm showing up on time. I should be early, right? Whereas in other parts of the world, there's a much more flex component to when things start, when things wrap up. And that might not sound like a big deal, but I've seen it crash millions of dollars, $1 million deals, $1 billion acquisitions. So these things do matter. And there's great research out there that looks at it. The problem that I found was that the research, while it hit a ton of points that I was really interested in, and I think that a ton of people need to know about, the problem is that most of that research is incredibly academic and very dry and difficult to get through. It took me a year to get through one core book that I think was really one of the foundational points to it. But there's a lot of acronyms. There's a lot of academic phrasing that loves to kind of talk around and use very big words. And from a business perspective, I said, geez, can I just cut through the core of this? And what is it that we can apply and get to people quickly and effectively so that they don't have to churn through all this? You can if you want to, and if you're into it, you should definitely read this stuff. But if you don't have the time or energy for it, I'm trying to give some people some shortcuts here.
Fantastic. And this is actually a great segue to your book, The Accidental Business Nomad. At what point did you decide, or there's an insight, the light bulb going off?
Yeah.
There's a book here. I need to write a book about this. When did that occur?
I would love to tell you there was a moment. I think it was a series of moments. My light bulb moments are slow, dim burns that over time come together. I'd love to say that there was more of those, those moments. But I would say that there was a client years ago, a guy out of Texas. I write about him in the first chapter. I was starting to notice patterns of Western companies trying to expand, making the same mistakes. And I was trying to get my head around what was that pattern? What was this continual mistakes being made? And I thought this guy articulated it really well. he had all of this marketing material made in the US, and it was very US centric. There's nothing wrong with that. That was his market. It had baseball imagery, it had American spelling, it had all the, it was made for his audience. It's absolutely fine. But what he wanted to do was cut and paste it and just put it into Asia, right? So his expansion plan was to use the existing material and just replicate it, because if it could work in America, it'll work across Southeast Asia. That was his mindset. And I'm talking to him, and there's mega time zone differences. And I bring that up because I think it was probably late at night his time. And I bring that up because I think he wasn't entirely sober. And I was talking to him, and I was trying to say, look, you've got to change this. You've got to get rid of the baseball. People here don't play baseball. They don't know what that is. They know what it is, but they certainly don't care. And by the way, you're making yourself look as foreign as possible, and it's a put off. And he got really frustrated, and he said, you know what, just slap a dragon on it, make it Asian, and then there's our localization plan.
When I saw the chapter on slap a dragon, I had to read it twice because let me get exactly what this means, because I think it's hilarious and it's funny. Going back to the companies I used to work for, and who shall remain nameless, at least unless they go to my LinkedIn profile. That's it. And I saw that, believe it or not, Kyle, fail even regionally here in Chicago.
I believe that.
It's utterly amazing. But please keep going.
Yeah, so I think that was the guy that got me really thinking, because there's a lot of people out there like that, and they don't necessarily have to be that almost, that almost comes across as like a racist statement, or certainly stereotypical, but sometimes people accidentally do it as well. And I started thinking about this phrase, slapdragons. The original title of the book was called Slapdragons, based off of this guy, and the idea was that companies go in and essentially they cut and paste their business model, their approach, their working style, and they think that the rest of the world is going to be the same. And if they're not the same, they can change the rest of the world to be like them. That's not the case. So what is the case is that people have to have that global mindset approach to be able to understand what these differences are and to adapt accordingly. And whether you're traveling and having to do it, or whether you're doing it all remotely now, which I think is probably a more realistic thing that's going to happen in the next year or so, you have to have that kind of awareness if you're going to be successful working globally.
You use two words there, understand, or seek to understand, and then adapt. And, as an individual who really loves behavior and studying behavior, that's one of the key components for individual relationships. I'm never going to get you to be just like me. I have to understand you. I have to understand me, but then I'm the one that has to adapt.
Correct.
And it's an amazing that it's the same thing, at an organization and a cultural level.
For me, if you want to say, well, wait a minute, okay, because we all talk about this, and I think everybody kind of can conceptually agree with that. So where do you start? And to me, it's actually, you've got to understand yourself first. Like, you can't adapt away from something if you don't know. It's that old fish in water, right? Like, fish asks the other fish, "How's the water today?" And the first fish says, "Well, what's water?" Like, how do you adapt if you don't know what you're surrounded by? I'll give you an example. So I talked about one of those working styles being relationships, how relationships are built. I'd mentioned there's like task-based approaches where it's much more focused on getting jobs done versus relationship-focused, building those relationships first. And I showed these data sets to American companies all the time. And I would say 9 times out of 10, the American companies go, "Oh, yeah. You know what, though? We are relationship focused." And it always makes me laugh because they might be relationship focused, and in their world, they are relationship focused, but that doesn't mean that they're relationship focused when it gets compared to other parts of the world or other organizations. And so this is a moment where you've got to swallow your pride a little bit and be willing to take a wider look at what else is out there and how business gets done. It might not be right, might not be wrong, but the more you can see what's out there by understanding, who you are, who your company is, what are your values, how do you apply those values, then you can start comparing and contrasting what else is out there. And the people that know that and can bridge those gaps, those are the people that figure out and understand what it means to be globally minded.
Kyle, I think I just figured out your business model is
tell me.
Is you get the companies here, let's just use the US, we're not going to pick on anybody else, think they're the be all end all. They decide we're going to go, it'll cut costs, increase efficiencies, do things, become more virtual. They take a trip overseas and decide, okay, we're going to do it here. They do it. They probably crash and burn a little bit. In using the old Ghostbusters metaphor, who you got to call, and it's going to be Leadership Nomad.
I like it. I like the commercial. I'll take it. But you're exactly right. I mean, the amount of money when they crash and burn a little bit, when you crash and burn a little bit, you're not talking about tens of thousands of dollars. You're talking about hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars to make these mistakes and to go through it. And again, what I'm trying to do is, okay, sometimes people have to get burned a little bit, but the big guys, the big companies are still making these mistakes. And I believe just in the situation that we're in, COVID-19, the fact that we've gone work from home, the work remote stuff is building up. As the economy goes down, companies are going to be looking for cost cutting. I believe there's going to be another wave of outsourcing. It's probably going to be done more quietly because people have to be a little bit more careful from a nationalistic standpoint and all the rest. But they're going to go through this process. They're going to go through this slapdragon mistake approach, and there's going to be a lot of frustration and a lot of money wasted. Until people start realizing these variations around the planet.
So if we could get your book in front of as many companies as possible that really realize business, the way we've always done it, has changed. We need to look at, virtual. How do we do it? How do we accomplish it? How do they go about learning from this book? And is there like a template, a playbook? What are they doing to take away from this book and then realizing, hey, we got to go out and get some help?
So what this book is not is a prescriptive how-to. I think that the topic is so big and complicated and everybody goes through their own journey. So it's not like there's a specific roadmap here. What I'm trying to do is give people more of a compass. And I'm starting that by getting them to read these stories, hopefully, in a lighthearted way. I'm trying to keep this thing fun and get people to the point where they go, wait a minute, okay, I need to be a little bit more aware of these differences. And now I'm starting to put together a kit of ideas as to what I can do about it. So what the book does is it's organized. Each chapter is a variation of a story that kind of builds on itself. And at the end of each chapter, you get a couple of takeaway ideas. Those all come together towards the end in what I call the survival toolkit, survival guide. These really are the focus of the consulting and training and workshops that I do with companies anyway. So that's kind of where it takes you. But as I said, this is not a traditional prescriptive how-to book. It's more about getting people thinking about these as a challenge and defining it and giving them a good chunk of tools to get them started down that path.
Excellent. And if we could circle back to, again, to this global pandemic, COVID-19, what are some practices, ideas, action items, just given what you've just laid out for us? What are some of the concerns that our companies need to be aware of before they actually, jump into the water and not realize it's a lot deeper than they expected?
I would rephrase that a little bit. So I would also add companies that already have this global footprint and now have to figure out how do you operate within this. So there's going to be, we were listing out all of the catastrophes that have happened this year. And, we started with the Philippines. There was a volcano erupting in January. I think there was a couple of typhoons. There was the wildfires in Australia. There's the Hong Kong political situation, the impeachment in the US, Brexit. Like this is the year of disruption and craziness, both man-made and natural. So the question then is, how do you navigate in that kind of craziness? And to me, the starting point is focusing on your community. If you are expanding, or if you already have a team that is globally dispersed, who maybe they get together a couple of times a year, that's probably not happening here in 2020. You need to be focused on community building to get these guys moving and marching together with a updated sense of purpose. Your plans from 2019 are probably not what they are here as we're talking in June of 2020. Does your organization know what's in your head? And in my experience, and from the companies that I'm talking to, and the survey work that I'm doing, what I keep finding is individuals within organizations saying that they really don't know where their company is going. And so, again, going back to that word community, what additional steps can be done to bring people together, to get them talking about things in ways that maybe they weren't used to doing before, and to building those relationships? One of the challenges of remote work is that it's oftentimes very much conference call driven. And conference calls come almost always with an agenda. Multiple points. Here's what we want to do. We want to be respectful of people's times. Let's bang through this stuff in and out. Well, everything I just described, that's a task-based approach to getting stuff done. Now, a majority of the planet falls under more relationship-based approach to getting stuff done. Conference calls are almost structured from a very Western mindset from that standpoint. And so even thinking about it that way, one way is to go, well, wait a minute, what could we be doing differently from a community building standpoint? I'm not suggesting we get rid of conference calls. I'm not suggesting that at all. But it might mean that more time needs to get focused on unstructured conversations, one-on-one check-ins, conversations, maybe activities that are not specifically task-focused, but more geared towards building community. I think if companies and organizations put more effort towards that, I think that'll be a very strong foundation building for as things start picking up, because you need to have your team marching to the same beat now. So that's what I'm working with companies to do right now.
Fantastic. And I am curious, given the work that you're doing and these conversations, knowing what we're going through right now, are there organizations out there that you have seen, know of, that really are just like, this is the way it's got to be done? These guys are doing it really well. Maybe they're not perfect, but they're doing it really well.
Yeah, so nobody's perfect. I like you'd mentioned earlier in this conversation, I'm trying not to, in the book, I try not to name names. Like, I'm not trying to name and shame. So all of the guys I said at the beginning, of the book, that all of the names have been changed to protect the guilty. The first answer to that, and I'm looking for this all the time, I have not seen a company universally figure this out or really particularly do this well at a overarching, consistent level. What I have seen are rock star individual leaders and people who are leaders at all different levels of organizations. So I've seen teams that are bulletproof in terms of being able to work across cultures, who just have a tight-knit way of doing things, operating within an organization that has more of a patchwork approach to it. So my answer is that the best practices exist, they're being done, but I think that they're being done in smaller batch ways. I'm working with some companies on this transformation, but it's a long process. It's not only a top-down driven process, but it's a bottom-up process to get, to develop the next generation leaders, but also to get the current leaders to be able to think about some of these things a little bit differently and try and remove those slapdragon blinds that we were mentioning earlier.
Fantastic. Kyle, in the time we have left, is there, I don't know, I would call it an insight to go. I mean, we do use that term on our podcast, of something you'd like to leave our listeners with. Maybe it's a quote, a book you've read, an article, something that, to talk about the importance of your work and things that our listeners need to think differently about.
So I maybe a way to summarize how I think about all of this, and it gets into a lot of what we talked about today, which is the fact that there's a lot of anecdotes that are out there. You can learn from good examples from what's worked and what hasn't worked. And there's a lot of great data. And so to me, the way I think about it, if I try and put that into a formula, persuasion or understanding is basically what happens when a good story meets great data. And when I think about global leadership, I recommend people play with both of those things. Look out for those stories. Tell and share those stories. Share those experiences. I find the companies just don't do that. They hide a lot of their failure because they don't want to face the music. Combine those types of stories with the data that I've been mentioning throughout this conversation, and that's where you start really getting some good insight and some ideas as to where to go forward with it.
Fantastic. And Kyle, if our listeners would like to learn more about you and your work, where are the best places for them to go?
I'd say two places. My website is leadershipnomad.com. There's info on the book on the front page. It'll take you to a book landing site. In fact, we're putting up this week a bunch of free resources that can be downloaded. I keep mentioning working style differences and some other templates that are designed to help teams figure stuff out and kind of build community. So that's all coming on in the next few days here in early June. There's a newsletter, which is just goes out once a month, super simple ideas that we're talking about here. And then LinkedIn is my social media platform of preference. So you can find me on LinkedIn. In fact, my handle is Slapdragons.
Fantastic. Well, we will certainly provide the backlinks to your website, Leadership Nomad, as well as the backlink to LinkedIn as well. And we'll include links to one of the global leaders in online bookstores, whoever that might be. Kyle, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the Success Insight podcast. And I think I'm on a roll lately. These subjects are like near and dear to my heart, especially this one, because the cultural intelligence, just being able to navigate cross-culturally, and just remembering my little crash and burn. But it's just kind of a wonderful way to kind of bring it home. Hey, and I don't want to be remiss when you're not doing this great work. You've got your lovely wife with you in Singapore. What do you do for fun?
I kick back and relax by training for Ironman distance triathlons.
Oh my God. How do you do that in Singapore where it's probably hot and humid?
Yes, we're at the equator pretty much. So I've likened it to if you try and do a bunch of jumping jacks inside a sauna, that's kind of what it feels like. But do that for a bunch of time. Look, you train here, and then I try and escape and do the long distance stuff in more reasonable climates. And then when you go to these places that don't have 90% humidity, it's like you're coming down from the mountains. It's like you've been training at altitude. So, look, it's actually not so bad. You kind of figure it out. But I might not be thinking that it's not so bad later today when I'm sweating around the middle of this hot sun here.
Oh, that's fantastic. By the way, I know there was an anecdote in the book about you're having a conversation walking down the street, and the other guy, I mean, you're like, I would be sweating bullets. I probably have 3 shirts per day. And the other guy, he's just like barely listening. So right. I was really curious how that worked out. But Kyle, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast. It's your early morning, so I'm glad we were able to kind of coordinate it. You've got your coffee, and that's good. And just a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much.
No, I appreciate it, Howard. Thank you so much.
All right, folks, we have just been chatting with Kyle Hegarty. He is the author of The Accidental Business Nomad, a survival guide for working across a shrinking planet. And do check out Kyle and his work at the Leadership Nomad, as well as connecting with him on LinkedIn. If this is a topic that you're interested in, maybe you're working with an organization that is contemplating some of these changes and kind of going global. But in any case, for me, this was just a topic that I'm very passionate about, just given my coaching background. And so it was a great way to spend, 30, 40 minutes having a great conversation about a great topic. If you enjoyed this topic, please do leave your comments on the Success Insight podcast page. You can also go to our LinkedIn company page, Facebook company page. We're also on YouTube, as well as the podcast sites, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Apple Podcasts. So we want to know what you think, and we really appreciate that as well. So, folks, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, be safe, take care of yourselves, take care of your friends and family, and we will see you on the next episode of the Success Insight Podcast. Take care now.
Success Insight is a production of Fox Coaching and First Story Strategies. Find us online, successinsightpodcast.com.